Imagine that DNA ligase enzyme is a seamstress for a high-tech, futuristic fashion company. This company specializes in making long, beautiful strips of fabric, which code for different outfits. Each strip of fabric is like DNA, and the seamstress is DNA ligase. The seamstress's job is to carefully go over each strand of fabric, looking for any small outer edge cuts or nicks that shouldn't be there. Nicks in the fabric can cause the fabric to be faulty, and it will not be able to create the beautiful clothing that it has been specially designed for. The seamstress DNA ligase is in charge of monitoring the outside edges of the strand for any nicks or tears. The outer edges of the strand are made of a phosphate sugar backbone, where a sugar molecule is connected to a phosphate molecule, which is connected to a sugar, which is connected to a phosphate. I'm sure you get my drift, that the phosphate sugar backbone of DNA, or the fabric strand, is constant. However, occasionally along this long strip of fabric, there is a nick, or slice, along the edge within this phosphate sugar backbone. If we zoom in to the individual pieces of the backbone, we can see that the sugar molecule always has a hydroxyl group off of the third carbon, and a phosphate group off of the fifth carbon. These two groups, when bonded together, form a phosphodiester bond. This bond is what holds the backbone together. A broken phosphodiester bond is what results in a nick. Nicks can be caused by a few things: DNA replication, chemical exposure or physical handling from DNA recombination, and accumulation of these nicks lead to a faulty strand. DNA ligase is commonly used in DNA replication to join together Okazaki fragments. So, the seamstress DNA ligase has a very important job. Let's hear what she has to say about it. My job is so boring. I hate my stupid job. All I do every single day is look for... Oh my gosh! Is that a nick? Sure is! Yippee! I love my job! In one of her hands, or within the enzyme's active site, is a very special sewing needle that is crucial for DNA ligase's seamstress job. The needle, if we look closely, is a lysine amino acid residue. Specifically, this needle is lysine 34A. Now that she's found the nick, DNA ligase needs to energize herself so that she's ready for action. Wow, you know what would really energize me right now is if I could just take a nice, free-floating molecule of ATP and thread it through my lysine needle. Because this is a futuristic fairy tale, ATP can represent a spool of thread, which DNA ligase needs to complete her seamstress job. Since this job is literally DNA ligase's entire life, nothing fires her up more than cutting off a piece of thread from this spool of ATP. Now she finally has all her tools and the energy to do her job. Let's take a closer look. The amino group of lysine 34 acts as a nucleophile and attacks the alpha phosphate group of ATP. Since this is a substitution, the remainder of the ATP molecule, or the diphosphate, is discarded. The remaining intermediate is called the lysine AMP complex. Magnesium helps to electrostatically stabilize the double-bonded oxygens in the phosphate groups and the lysine AMP complex. The seamstress also has two other lysine residues. These are her arms, and they are lysine 238A and lysine 240A. She uses these two arms to stabilize the negative oxygens in the ATP group electrostatically and with hydrogen bonds. She also uses her arms to hold the ATP molecule in such a way that the correct alpha phosphate group will be attacked by the nucleophilic amino group of the needle, or lysine 34. This ligase AMP intermediate is covalently bonded and represents the threaded needle. DNA ligase has to make sure that the 3' end of the strand is lined up with only a 5' end. Let's take a look. Wow, we can see that on the third carbon of one end is a hydroxyl group, and on the fifth carbon of the other end of the tear is a phosphate group. So yes, they're correctly lined up. Now she can get to work. Let's see what DNA ligase has to say about the first step of her sewing process. I'm not like other regular seamstresses. I have AMP thread, which is magical and incredibly sticky. So, my first step is that I'm going to use my needle and AMP thread and transfer the AMP to the phosphate end of the tear. It is important to note that in the meantime, magnesium and the other two lysine residues are still working hard to electrostatically stabilize the oxygen atoms. Now, the oxygen on the first DNA fragment with the phosphate group acts as a nucleophile and attacks the AMP ligase intermediate phosphate group. Because this is also a substitution reaction, the lysine 34 is removed, and the new intermediate is a DNA AMP intermediate. The hydroxyl group of the other DNA fragment acts as a nucleophile and attacks the phosphate group on the end of the DNA AMP complex. The hydroxyl group deprotonates, and because this is also a substitution reaction, the AMP is released. What we are left with is a repaired phosphodiester bond. The phosphate sugar backbone is once again continuous. DNA ligase has done her job. The seamstress DNA ligase can now continue on her search for nicks in the fabric or DNA backbone.